Hello, and thank you for tuning into the Convo presented by Leadership Indianapolis. My name is Ebony Chappelle, and I am Manager of Programs and Communications. And today I am talking with Andrew Bradley of Prosperity, Indiana. Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Great, Ebony. Thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what Prosperity, Indiana does in the community for people that are unaware.
Sure. Prosperity Indiana is the multi-sector statewide association for community economic development. And if you don't know what that means by the description, you could think of us as we are the association for all the organizations in Indiana who are strengthening our communities and improving people's lives. So whether it's nonprofits, who are community development organizations helping people gain affordable housing, or they are the financial institutions that are helping people to break out of the debt trap and to be able to build assets and wealth for themselves and their communities. That's who we are. We also, though, also have members who are cities or county organizations, and even some private companies who want to be part of the conversation as well.
Great. And it's so timely because housing is a topic that has been covered in the news very heavily during this year's legislative session. Leadership Indianapolis, we also had a discussion series on housing where we talked with a lot of your colleagues. So bring us up to speed with what some of the top things are, your top priorities right now.
Absolutely. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of this discussion and for hosting these kinds of discussions. Because as you mentioned, housing has been a big issue all throughout the COVID pandemic. And so that's how I would start out by saying is that we approach housing and the need for housing stability as healthcare. Housing is healthcare. And without that basic foundation of people being able to have a place to safely lay their head at night and be able to shelter and stay away from the effects of the pandemic, then not only does that put their family at risk as individuals, but we've seen evidence that it increases the spread of COVID throughout communities. So knowing that, Prosperity Indiana and our partners in the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition have really been setting out to try to ensure that no Hoosier is evicted or made homeless due to the pandemic. And then we're also looking ahead at how do we recover and rebuild in ways that increase opportunities for affordable and stable housing throughout the state.
Again, super important because I think that a lot of us take our housing for granted. We take for granted being able to stay in a warm environment, to shelter at home, which is the advice that the CDC is giving us right now and other medical professionals when it comes to preventing the spread. What is one thing that you would share with people who maybe, have never really paid attention to this, who haven't been personally impacted to help them understand that this is significant and everyone should be paying attention to it?
I think something that it really came home to me, seeing some studies come out of what I was just talking about how having stable housing is so key and fundamental to responding to COVID. There was a study that was done out of Philadelphia that found for every 70 evictions that resulted in one additional COVID death. And Philadelphia is a little different than Indy or the rest of the state, but it starts to make sense that every time a family is evicted, they end up having to couch surf, staying in the living rooms or on the floors of a neighbor or relative's house. Or if they don't have that available, then they end up in a homelessness shelter or some other congregate setting where they're not able to do what the CDC recommends in terms of staying 6 feet apart and being able to regularly wash and all that kind of thing. So when you don't have that stable housing, people are bunched up together. And that's where the science shows that bunching up, doubling up is what leads to increased spread. And that in turn, as I said, doesn't just affect families, but it affects entire communities. And it's not just the public health aspect; it's also the economic aspect. We've known the dangers of eviction and housing instability for years, but we're really seeing it now, where you have so many of the same families who are Indiana's low-income renters. These are the people who are working in food services, hotel and accommodations. Those are the same people who have been most likely to have been affected by job layoffs. Even temporarily, it might set them back in such a way where they haven't been able to keep up on rent. And those are the folks that may end up being on the front lines of being evicted. So again, it's that economic backup. And one other aspect that I'll toss in is that then there's a social component too. For children who are part of these families, if they end up being evicted, we know that that impacts their educational capacity. Imagine if you're in a school that is working virtually and suddenly they have no home to learn virtually from. That could really set them back, not just for the short term, but for the long term.
Yeah, you bring up some really excellent points. And one that stuck out to me as well that I share with people is that Marion County had one of the worst eviction rates in the country, and this was pre-COVID. So
Mhm.
it seems that the pandemic has just pretty much, ripped the veil off of some things that folks were not as immediately aware of before. What are some of the things that you all have been doing to support folks that are experiencing this right now?
Well, as I said, Prosperity Indiana, we're the association for all the people who are on the front lines of COVID. All the organizations that are, some of them are homelessness prevention organizations or the ones who are trying to find affordable housing. And they're telling us that COVID is really stressing their ability and taxing their ability to provide those services, and that the whole support system is overloaded. So we've really been working on the side of trying to find policy solutions to lift that burden so that the net doesn't break and people fall through the gaps. So with that, I mentioned that we had helped to form this Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. Um, did that back in April, and we've been trying to find those policy solutions and trying to create conversations wherever we can so that all of the stakeholders are brought together to find those solutions. So that's come to play when the state has put together a emergency rental assistance program. We provided some input and guidance on that and some recommendations. And we may talk about this a little bit to come, but there's a brand new version of that rental assistance program about to come out. Something else that
Yeah,
we've
I
done is,
noticed on the news
go ahead.
shortly before our conversation, a few days before us recording this, that another over $400 million was going to be allocated through federal funding to help with that rental assistance. So that's really good news.
Yeah, that's maybe the most promising thing that's happening right now. This is a season of, there's some good news, some bad news, but that is definitely a good thing, is that Congress passed the relief package in late December. It means $448 million is coming Indiana's way. Some of that will be split out to cities. So for example, the city of Indianapolis will get about 29 million. Hamilton County will get 10 million. Those groups will administer their own programs. There's a few others in northern Indiana as well. The balance of the state will then have $372 million that they will use to launch a new emergency rental assistance program shortly. So each of those programs is going to be a little bit different in terms of how they are targeting the hardest hit families, but they all share some common bonds in that they will all be able to provide 12 months of back rent and then up to 3 months of forward rent. So it's possible that families may be able to have 15 months of rent paid for through that, in addition to utility assistance.
I know that's going to be so helpful to a number of people. I know there are a lot of moving parts right now. You are
Mhm,
at session virtually and in person as we speak. That's something that is
mhm.
keeping you going. On a personal note, what are the leadership lessons that have helped inform and guide how you operate during this time that we're experiencing?
I think a leadership lesson that I've taken myself from my career is to look for partnerships wherever you can find them. And that especially when you are working on the behalf of some of the most vulnerable populations in Indiana, it is really important to have broad partnerships and to bring those stakeholders together. And the example that I'll give is that Prosperity Indiana teamed up with the Indiana Association for United Ways to put together a housing stability roundtable where we had not just some of the service providers and those folks on the front lines that I've talked about that we typically work with, but we also had some of the largest housing providers in the state and some investors and realtors and state agency folks and then public health experts all come together and put their heads together about what's necessary for housing stability in Indiana. And that was really important because there was some really broad consensus about what's necessary. 84% of that group decided that the public health impact of evictions is a high or medium priority. And 92% said that getting emergency rental assistance to the folks that need it the most is very important. So using that as a stepping stone, we were able to explore some other longer term options and some of the factors that you mentioned, why Indiana has a backlog of an eviction crisis that has now been exacerbated. So using that, we're going to come back to that group in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to come up with some more concrete steps that Indiana is going to need to take to provide housing stability in the future.
Great to hear all of that. And thank you again, Andrew, for having this conversation with me today.
Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. And thank you to each and every one of you for tuning into the Convo. For more information on Leadership Indianapolis, you can visit us at leadershipindianapolis.com.